Hi, folks, with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of incarceration, putting people in prison. Is it a deterrent? Does it work? And if it doesn't work, what are the other options that could or should be explored? Now, I saw a recent interview, I suppose you could call it, where the mayor of a major US city and the police chief of that city, both of them are black women, one of them a lesbian, affirmative action, Democrat installed affirmative action people, and then a Jewish activist, human rights lawyer, who I think is homosexual. So now the Jewish human rights activist lawyer is been made the Attorney General. So you couldn't have the Jewish human rights activist lawyer has been made the Attorney General. So you couldn't have a more sort of leftist type group running the show there. And they came at this from a couple of directions. Well, the crime rates are high, so if we stop putting people in prison and we stop recording the crimes, then the crimes will go down. Now, because there are so many black people being arrested for committing crimes, that means it's a racist, fascist, Nazi, bigoted, white supremacist, swastika hellhole. And so black people continue to commit crimes, but we just won't convict them or put them in prison anymore. So we can kind of say that it's no longer a problem because we're not arresting people for committing crimes. Therefore, no crimes are occurring. Now, it's a fantasy world that makes Alice in Wonderland look like a reality TV show, but it's an interesting take on things. Now, I think this is a bit nuanced. So my view here is that it's not simply a matter of locking people up, or not, as some claim. That shouldn't be ruled out, incidentally. But is it just that? Is that the only option? Now, some of the arguments for and against this is say, well, black people, they're black people career criminals. Here's a guy who's 50 years old, and he spent in juvenile detention. He spent something like 30 years plus in detention, juvenile and adult detention, and in prison. He's only out for a few months before he commits another crime and is going back into prison. So obviously prison isn't working in that guy's case. So what do we do with people like that? And the argument then is that the black community actually has a very large number of people in this category where incarcerating them just doesn't work. It doesn't stop them from misbehaving. So what are then the options? If you assume there's a hardcore, quite a large hardcore, by the way, as in the millions, if there's a hardcore of black people where prison is not a deterrent, then what do? If you accept that they're going to commit crimes as soon as they get out, such as murder and so on, then you don't want to let them out, because then you're inflicting that on the rest of the community. Keeping them in prison doesn't seem to achieve anything. So what else is there? Now, this is where the different ideas come in, and where leftist activists come. Well, all you do is just give them a social work. You just give them more handouts, give them more food stamps, give them more stuff. Just give them more free stuff, and then it won't be a problem. Okay, so if someone can prove themselves to be societally dysfunctional to the max, then that entitles them that everyone else should pay for endless and lots of free stuff for them, and that's the only way to get them to behave, or the only way to get them not to go around killing people. That kind of doesn't sound like a winning formula to me. But now the idea of the social work, that if they just get people who understand them and who they can talk to, or who can help them navigate through things, then life's complexities, then maybe that'll work for them. You couldn't assign enough social work. Similarly, the social workers themselves only seem to have an IQ of 80, so I don't know if that's going to work. How exactly are they going to help? So that's fraught. You could have a real hit and miss thing, and just how effective that social worker happens to be or not be. So again, it comes back to this issue: what do you do? So just picture this: you're a judge in a court. Okay, so Deshaun is dragged, or Shaniqua was dragged in front of you, they're arrested for the millionth time. They've already been imprisoned a gazillion times, and they're there for some, they've beaten someone senseless, they've murdered someone, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. They've hijacked 10 cars, and so what do you do? What do you do with that person? I mean, what can you do? It's okay. Well, prison for you, Shaniqua, but that's been tried before and hasn't worked or even come close to working. And as soon as they get out, they just do the same thing again. So I don't know what you can do with people like that. There's been so many different ways that have been tried throughout history of what do you do about criminals, particularly repeat offenders and hardcore criminals. What do you do? Do you, put them in a special prison colony like the British tried that? They're sending prisoners to Australia, for example, or Botany Bay, as it was called back then. So they would send convicts there. Not all of whom, by the way, were hardened criminals. Some had only had one offence, and even then, well, today we would think would be quite a minor offence. And then they had to create a number of prison colonies for the prison colony. So they created another prison colony in Tasmania from around Sydney, where the original settlement was, to Tasmania, and then created another penal colony on a remote island to send the most difficult people. So and then they had a rocky outcrop in Sydney Harbour. They put the most misbehaving criminals, chained them to the out. So all these things were tried, but nothing really worked. And inevitably, when you've got a strictly binary sort of thing, it invites corruption, invites gaming the system one way or another. For example, you get a bunch of supposedly career criminals or habitual criminals, as they used to call it, and then they go and work in prison farms, which are in turn exploited by all sorts of sleazy politicians. So there's no quick push button answer. Do you euthanize people, take them out the back and shoot them or something, or well, that's a bit drastic. So I don't know about that working. So what are they now? The only solutions that anyone can think of are ones that are incredibly expensive, where you'd be spending millions of dollars per person trying to convert them from being socially dysfunctional and being somehow dysfunctional. Train them as give them job training, or make sure they get a job, all these sorts of things. But does that make them? Will they stay behaving or not? Will they be careless with money, and thus they then I better go and rob a store, or I better steal, or I better steal that car. Or also I've spoken to black people, and they say, well, gee, I don't have much money, I don't have any, and I look at all these rich white people driving around in Maseratis, and I want that. I want that Maserati. I want that hot white chick that the guy's got in the passenger seat. I want that waterfront house. I want that. I want to have those things. Why can't I just take them? And again, the mentality comes back to, well, if you have it, why won't you share it with me? Because the black community shares their stuff, many of them anyway, with other members of the community. So why won't the white people share what they have? And I don't have any mechanism or means of getting that house, or getting the Maserati, or getting the hot white chick. So why can't I just take it? And so there are a whole lot of problems and challenges built in. But the black activist community perceive the imprisoning of black people for committing crime. Well, it's white man's crime. It's not legitimate. It's white man's law. It's not legitimate. And a lot of the black people, in fact, much of the black community in the US and elsewhere now, have been encouraged to believe this, that that's just white man's law. It's not legitimate. It's white man's police force. It's not legitimate. It's white man's court. It's not legitimate. I don't have to fight. I was just unlucky in getting caught. That's all it was. None of these things are legitimate. I'm just being punished by the white man, just the same as slavery, just the same as Jim Crow, just the same. And so they tend to see it in the wider miasma of oppression. And they're very much encouraged to think that way. So how do you stop this oppression? Well, just don't put them in prison. Well, what about stopping them from committing crime? No. You don't stop them committing crime, because that's just restorative justice. What you do is you don't put them in prison. So this is really not an answer. Now, I don't know what the answer is. Should any black career criminal in the West be offered, well, look, you can spend 20 years in prison, or we'll deport you to Africa, and you have the option of reapplying to come back to the US or the West, in 20 years' time or 10 years' time or something. Should that be an option? Would that be gamed and exploited by politicians? Probably. What safeguards could be put in place? But this comes back to the original: what can be done? The idea of just not prosecuting or arresting black people who commit crimes, that's absurd. The idea of spending millions of dollars per person to maybe change their behaviour, that's simply not feasible. To just say, well, we'll just assign a social worker and that'll fix it, that's not going to work. So exactly what will work, what could work? But from all the ideas I've seen on the table, none of them so far, again, the ones I've seen, none of them seem to be practical or feasible or affordable. So what are your ideas? You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.